Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in standing by Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson is, of course, hemorrhaging political capital. It's an absolute madness in the eyes of all political commentators under normal circumstances. So why has he done it? And no, I don't necessarily think that it is the obvious reason that keeps doing the rounds. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, what has Cummings got on Johnson? This is what everyone seems to be asking. And although I don't rule out the possibility that Johnson is being blackmailed by, to keep Cummings on, basically, I also don't think it's the most likely reason, if indeed there is just one reason. Yes, Johnson was in the thick of the Vote Leave campaign, which was headed up by Dominic Cummings, along with the likes of Priti Patel, Dominic Raab and Michael Gove, all now amongst the most senior and influential members of the government. And yes, that group broke the law. And because that group broke the law, that means that some of those individuals must have carried out criminal acts. But we will have to wait for a decent government to emerge before the criminal investigations are allowed to continue, because, surprise, surprise, they've been blocked by the government so far. But this is why people just assume that Dominic Cummings must have the goods on Johnson, and why Johnson has to put up with Cummings' public antics. But the thing is, and there's an awful lot of commentators close to Johnson note this, Johnson doesn't seem to put up with Dominic Cummings. He quite likes what he does. And so I am more convinced by other possibilities. People seem to largely base the blackmail notion on the fact that Boris Johnson simply wouldn't be investing so much of his credibility in keeping Dominic Cummings for any other reason. But that is to forget about Johnson's exceptionalism. So take this letter, which is from Eton, the very exclusive private school that Boris Johnson attended in the 80s, to his father. And this has been doing the rounds recently as well. And it's very, very interesting. I'll read it all out, but there's a particular point I want to focus on. It says, Boris really has adopted a disgracefully cavalier attitude to his classical studies. It is a question of priorities, which most of his colleagues have no difficulty in sorting out. Boris sometimes seems affronted when criticised for what amounts to a gross failure of responsibility, and surprised at the same time that he was not appointed captain of the school for next half. I think he honestly believes that it is churlish of us not to regard him as an exception, one who should be free of the network of obligation which binds everyone else. Bear in mind, this is a school that is used to dealing with spoilt little brats. And so even by that standards, Johnson had this attitude that he was exceptional, that he was different from the rules. So yes, I think it's perfectly plausible that he will just keep putting in his credibility, not realizing that he's sinking himself politically, because like, the school was saying, and he's obviously not changed, he just doesn't understand why people are not treating him as something exceptional. He went on the television to defend Cummings on Sunday. He said, look, I've talked to him. He's a thoroughly good chap. Everything's above board. Take my word for it. He's probably genuinely stunned that people aren't taking his word for it. It's like, but I said it was fine. What? I said it was fine. Why is it not fine? He doesn't get it. So are there other possibilities? Yes, there are other possibilities. One of which is the notion of the supposed mastermind that is Dominic Cummings. Now, I think he's pretty far away from being a mastermind. He claims a lot of credit for the Brexit referendum, and he was certainly instrumental. There's no denying that, being responsible for the Brexit bus, for example. But he wasn't even the only group involved in the Brexit Leave vote. He certainly wasn't the conductor of all the schemes that led to Brexit, an idea which he later called dumb. He actually said people were dumb for voting Brexit. But look at what he did try to orchestrate that was entirely him. So last year he tried to orchestrate the no-deal Brexit exiting last autumn. All of his schemes to do so failed. In fact, he even ended up having the highest court in the land label the Prime Minister's actions in regards to this unlawful with a unanimous verdict. I mean, how's that for a political advisor? Boris Johnson's political advisor advised him into a situation where the Prime Minister was threatened with contempt of court. The Prime Minister was threatened with jail. by a senior court. Was there ever a previous Prime Minister who wouldn't have sacked such an advisor for that alone? The only reason he got the general election was because the opposition leaders royally screwed up. Had they been sensible, and they were sensible for quite a while, but had they continued to be sensible, Johnson would still now have a minority government with Parliament dangling him on their string. And actually, our coronavirus response as a result would be a lot better. And the general election campaign itself, I mean, that was a stunning success, wasn't it? Sure, yeah. But Cummings wasn't in charge of that. That was another shitweasel by the name of Isaac Levidow. And then there's the coronavirus response itself. Now, that could hardly have been handled more disastrously, both the practical side of it and the PR side of it. Even this latest scandal is being inexpertly handled. Johnson could easily have said that Cummings's behaviour was unacceptable and sacked him. Cummings could then have said that he acted foolishly under the pressure of the virus. You know, all this stuff about caring father and stuff like that. He could have come out with all of that, full of concern for his kid, but he's really sorry. He recognises now, you know, having thought back on it, that really wasn't the thing to do. The public anger would have abated immediately, instantly. Johnson, in fact, would have even come out with some credit. He would have heightened his stock in the country. But then he'd have lost Cummings, you say? No, not at all. No. Dominic Cummings is limited in what he can do right now anyway, with COVID slowing his plans down considerably. Cummings could still advise the Prime Minister privately. He couldn't be paid from public funds, of course, and he wouldn't have security clearance to the civil service, yep. But he could just bide his time. He could still be advising the Prime Minister, paid for by party funds or Prime Minister directly. Wait for it all to blow over, and then Johnson could return him in a year or so when the coronavirus had passed its worst and this story had largely abated. And because he was contrite at the time, the only people who would object would be his political opponents, the same people who objected to him before all this. It would then be easy to call those objections political in nature, and the public would be as apathetic towards it as the usual rules breaking that goes on unpunished. In fact, it's actually possible that Johnson wouldn't have had to sack him at all, although that would have been the safest option, even temporarily. There would be, I think there would have been a political cost to trying to retain him under all circumstances. But it's the fact that they tried to come up with all this rubbish to defend his actions, contradictory rubbish to defend his actions, that show that neither Johnson nor Cummings, nor indeed any other senior cabinet minister, truly understands how to handle public relations. So no, Cummings isn't a mastermind. However, what if Boris Johnson genuinely believes that he is? Johnson is a lazy little toe rag. Even his supporters know this. He's also not that bright. He's not thick, but he's not that bright. You know, certainly not as thick as the likes of those he surrounds himself with in cabinet, but he's not an intellectual by most people's standards. But what if Boris Johnson is convinced that his rule would crumble immediately without Dominic Cummings to advise him and to do his dirty work for him? In such a case, Johnson may consider that letting Cummings go is tantamount to just resigning himself, that he couldn't possibly cope without him. There's probably a little bit more to it than that. Now, The Telegraph wrote an interesting piece. Of course, they know him personally and, you know, have also spoken to those who have been close to him for years. The Telegraph, for those who don't know, is a right-wing Tory supporting newspaper, not at the moment a Boris Johnson supporting newspaper, but nonetheless a paper that paid him £275,000 a year just to write a weekly column whilst he was a backbencher. And they had some interesting things that would absolutely explain it. So just very, very briefly. First of all, they noted that Boris Johnson has really been against advisors leaving him. Advisors have left him in the past, and as they've put it, he's generally been pleading with them not to. He's gone to lengths to retain trusted advisors. He likes, I mean, like anyone would. Anyone in his position would want trusted advisors around them. You have to be, with a political advisor, very frank, very open. There's no point in being cagey with your advisors. It's a bit like there's no point in being cagey with your doctor, is there? You've got to give them the full story in order for them to advise you properly. The same thing with a political advisor. So of course you need people you can trust, particularly when you're a dishonest little toe rag as well. He also hates confrontations, apparently. Now, I don't know this personally, although you could certainly say you've seen this in the general election campaign when he avoided interviews and debates. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, you know, there were certain interviewers who would completely tear him apart. Of course, he wanted to avoid those. No. The general election campaign was easy. It was so simple for him. All he ever did in any TV debates and interviews was to say something along the lines of, yes, terribly interesting question, and what the people of this great country feel is that this can best be solved by getting Brexit done. And if somehow it was something that had nothing to do with Brexit, then you just come in with your second response, which is yes, and then once we get Brexit done, we'll have much more time and resources to invest in X, Y and Z areas of British life. That's it. 2 answers to cover every question that you can possibly be asked. Makes no difference how good the interviewer is. Yes, they can expose your poor answers. They can point out you're not really answering the question, but they can do that without interviewing you. No problem at all. So the only reason that makes sense for Boris Johnson not wanting to do these interviews or debates is either one, because he just couldn't be asked, or two, because, as the Telegraph suggests, he doesn't like confrontation. An interview and a debate is confrontational. Now, with Dominic Cummings, the paper notes that what he has is an enforcer to act on his behalf. He's the one who will go around doing all the bullying that Johnson can't be asked with. He is confrontational. He does get in your face. Essentially, the Telegraph are convinced that Johnson feels he simply cannot do without Cummings, and there is no price he won't pay to retain his services. For me, that has more of a ring of credibility around it. I'm not saying the blackmail can't possibly be part of it. It just, for me, it doesn't quite ring true as the entire reason. Maybe it's a partial reason. I suspect not. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely think Cummings probably does have the goods on Johnson. But then wouldn't it be the same goods that Johnson could have on Cummings? After all, Cummings was in charge of that illegally operating group. But those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.